Welcome to this workshop organized by ECHA on applications for authorization for environmental endocrine disruptors. And specifically, as you'll see from the title of my presentation, which is coming up in a minute, applications for authorization for EDs for Nonophenol and its ethoxylates and octylphenol ethoxylates. I'm going to give you a short introduction, and in passing I will introduce a lot of the topics that other speakers this morning are going to deal with. The day is divided in two. Okay, thank you. Little bit about ECHA first, just very briefly. The agency in Helsinki is responsible for 4 pieces of legislation: for REACH, obviously, for classification, labeling and packaging, biocidal products regulation, and for prior informed consent. We have 4 committees in the agency and a 5th forum on enforcement. So you've got risk assessment, RAC, socioeconomic analysis is HEAC, 2 representative committees, member state and biocidal products. And the forum on enforcement is not a committee, but it's an exchange forum for information on enforcement. Program this morning, we have 2¼ hours. We're starting on time, which is very good. Thank you for that. Plenary presentations, 15 minutes plus 5 discussion. I hope we can keep it on track. I will probably be the first one to go over time, so we'll see. We have an hour for lunch. Unfortunately, there's no canteen available in the conference center. Brussels is still very much on holidays. Page 3 of your program gives a number of suggestions for lunch. We need you back in promptly, and please remember you've got to get back through security again. This afternoon we break into 4 groups. Not quite sure how we're going to arrange this. I'll be chairing you for this morning, and Pete will take over for this afternoon for the World Cafe. I will circulate among the 4 groups to listen to what's going on. Short coffee break, and then we'll try and get some feedback from the groups and wash up. So we should have you out of here by 4. Okay, next slide, please. Right, let's start into the background. 13th of July this year, both substances were added to Annex 14 of REACH on the basis of their endocrine disrupting properties. So that's through Article 57F, and specifically for the environment, not for human health. 2 entries, 42 and 43, added to Annex 14. Authorization for specific uses under Annex 14 can be granted based on adequate control, risk characterization ratios below 1 for threshold substances, or for non-threshold the benefits outweigh the risks and no suitable alternatives. That also applies where where threshold has not been demonstrated. Next slide, please. So our purpose today really is to have a comprehensive exchange of views between stakeholders, and we have a large section of pharmaceutical and chemical companies here today represented, plus some of their trade associations. We have a good cross-section of member states represented by competent authorities, and we have a whole lot of consultants. So I think we have an excellent mix to really discuss this and see where we can take it. Second point is a key one, whether it's possible to derive threshold or dose response relationship for these substances and to gather the necessary information. I think what we want to do from the ECHA side is raise awareness of the key issues, such as minimization, and you'll hear me come back to this throughout the next 10 or 15 minutes. We would, as usual, as we have with all of the other applications for authorization, try and assist where we can in helping companies develop good applications. That's in our interest as well. What we're not going to do this morning is to open any debate on whether these substances should be on Annex 14 or not. They're there, and that's that. I doubt if we're going to conclude on any recommended approach or even identify reference values in particular for these substances. And socioeconomic elements, we can certainly explore the bit in the middle, let's say, with dose response and see how you might determine impact, but I think the real socioeconomic elements are for a different discussion. So with those caveats, let's proceed and see where we get to. Next, please. I really want to draw your attention to this because this is key to the whole process, and it will stay key. I don't believe it will change. The Member State Committee of ECHA in 2012 and 2013, the dates are slightly different for each substance, identified them as substances of very high concern and made subsequent recommendations for Annex 14. Those documents give you the beginning of the thoughts from ECHA on how to deal with endocrine disruption. It's not a full story, but you can see the beginnings of it in those two identification documents. More importantly, I think in 2014, the RAC opinion on the Swedish restriction on NPnEO in textiles, this has later come into force as restriction entry 46A and was added in 2016. Now, it contains a quantitative PEC-PNEC risk assessment for nonophenol ethoxylates based on nonophenol data, but it does not conclude on any safe threshold. I think you have to read that very carefully to understand why. It does outline the remaining uncertainties quite clearly. If I say so myself, it's a well-written document. It was prepared by two very experienced rapporteurs supported by a secretariat who knew what they were doing, and it still stands as a very robust risk assessment. The last document I want to refer to as the basis for today and ongoing is the Commission communication to Council and Parliament from, if I'm correct, December 2016 on endocrine disruption properties, which has specific reference to RAC in it as to some of the problems that RAC might face and how to get around them. It states quite clearly that industry is responsible for demonstrating any threshold. It's as clear as daylight. It also has, if you read it carefully, some other interesting information. It comes to the conclusion, for example, that reptiles and echinoderms are particularly uncovered by any test data. And that's something to think about. Bottom line is that under these circumstances, with all that I've summed up there in sequence, is that RAC is really not in a position to provide reference values for entries 42 and 43. I think you can understand why from the foregoing. Next, please. I'm going to go back a little bit into authorization just to be sure that everybody understands what authorization really is and what the committee's role in it is. And this is really sort of preparatory for anybody who's contemplating preparing an application. I took the quote from the authorization title. Authorization is to ensure that risks from substances of very high concern are properly controlled and that these substances are progressively replaced by suitable alternatives while ensuring the good functioning of the EU internal market. It's a three-component sentence, and the three bits hang together. For me, the key word is progressive replacement. It doesn't imply some sort of abrupt ending of use. It implies a gradual and controlled replacement over a period of time. And that's what the implementation of the legislation has sought to do, and I think so far quite successfully. RAC and SEAC jointly evaluate and develop opinions on those applications, and they provide a recommendation for the length of the review period. At this point, the standard terms are 7 is normal, 4 is short, and 12 is long. And so far, in over 190 opinions, we've never gone beyond 12 years. We have gone lower than 4, but that was special circumstances. It wasn't a special punishment, if that's what you're thinking. The final decision to grant an authorization with a specific review period is taken by the Commission and scrutinized by the REACH committee along the way, as you all know, I'm sure. Duration of an authorization can be extended. That's following review again at the end of the review period by RAC and SEAC and a further Commission decision. So basically it's going round the circuit again. Process is almost identical. Next, please. I won't dwell too long on this because it's fairly complicated and you probably need to study some of the documents that ECHA has prepared to understand it fully. But on the 4th of July 2019, all of you who are going to submit should have submitted. The consequence is that you would have to stop production if you haven't already applied. Within 2 or 3 months, you've paid the invoice, and we have published on the ECHA website what we call the Broad Information and Use Package. It's about a 4-page document with the key elements of your application contained in it. It's intended to trigger the public consultation. Public consultation lasts for 8 weeks. It's primarily aimed at the providers of alternatives, to give them an opportunity to, well, if you like, confront the applicant and to provide ECHA with information on what real alternatives there are out there. Other presentations will deal with this in more detail. At the same time, you can see the blue bar at the bottom there, RAC and SEAC start to develop their opinion. During this period, RAC and SEAC have the right, under the legislation, to ask questions of the applicant. And they do so in nearly all cases. Sometimes there are 1 round, sometimes there are more rounds until we get clarity. We aim to get our opinions adopted in committee within the legal deadline, that's 10 months. They can be as early as 4 months, some in the middle, 7 months and 10. Normally we don't need all of the meetings available within that period to get them through. Then the applicant, who by the way is not in committee during the debates, does have the right to comment on the draft opinions at the end, and they can comment substantially. Mostly it's fairly difficult to change a fully fledged draft opinion, but sometimes we may have missed something. There may be an error, and that's the opportunity to correct or to adjust, and then we take that into account in deciding the final opinion. After that, it's sent to the Commission. It's published fully on the ECHA website. At least the confidential information is withdrawn and the non-confidential information is published. We encourage people to keep as little as possible confidential. It causes all sorts of problems in the process, and it doesn't really help you in the end. Next slide, please. I'm going to go into RAC opinions just to give you a flavor of what comes out in the final result as an applicant, what you could expect. RAC formulates its recommendations based on the risks posed by the use and the alternatives. That implies a fully fledged risk assessment in the chemical safety report. We look at hazard and exposure as you would expect. What we're really looking for is the second bullet. We examine the appropriateness and effectiveness of risk management measures in limiting the risk, in this case to the environment. That's really our job. That's the key part of our work. Out of that comes whether something is adequately controlled or whether it's appropriately minimized in terms of exposure and risk. We communicate our concerns to SEAC and the Commission. The opinions are joint, but at the draft stage, a RAC opinion is independent. So we recommend on the control of risk and its adequacy, and we look at the uncertainties in the risk assessment. That could be the quality of the data, that could be the quality of the writing, that could be some of the underlying assumptions. It's a very broad field. We normally recommend that an authorization should be granted, but we can recommend that it should not be granted. Hasn't happened yet, but the early part of the process is finished. We've got through about 200 opinions roughly, and there's a lot less tolerance of poor applications than there was. So be aware, we're expecting the process to improve as it develops and people learn. We can recommend a short or shorter review period for the authorization. In RAC's case, that's purely based on risk control concerns. It doesn't enter into the socioeconomics at all. Normally, the review period is left to SEAC, and it's on the basis of the socioeconomics. In 75% of the opinions so far, we have recommended additional conditions and monitoring arrangements. Sometimes the monitoring arrangements are just sort of a standard. It's something that the applicant has already been doing, and all we're saying is keep doing it. We might increase the frequency, but the burden is low. In some cases, we may dig down further and we may look for actual engineering conditions to improve the risk management measures. That's when it gets complicated. Next, please. Our conditions look sort of roughly like this in generic terms. For the authorization, in other words, for direct implementation. So when the Commission grants the application, this applies immediately. introduce, if you haven't done it already, continue if you're already doing it, or extend if it's not enough, monitoring of emissions to the environment. I've just replaced to the environment in what used to be in the workplace. We may vary the frequency depending on how we see the urgency. And I think it's fair to say that the Commission is become more demanding of hard frequencies in the conditions which we recommend over the last year. My colleague to the right is nodding, luckily. It's always good to see people nodding in the right direction. We can ask the applicant to review their current risk management measures, excuse the jargon here, RMM is just risk management measure, to address what we see as emission control concerns. They may be relatively vague concerns or relatively superficial, so we just say, do a review and see what's necessary to tighten things up. A level further is we pick on specific risk management measures and we say, improve these to reduce emissions immediately. And through questioning, we normally can get down this far that we're pretty sure of what's needed. Standard one is prepare and maintain records for inspection by the enforcement agencies. It's fairly obvious. A lighter version comes just for the review report. So these are things which would be maybe less frequent and which we expect to see if you come back again for a second try. And that would start with summarized monitoring. It's fairly obvious. Tell us everything you've been doing over the last 4, 7, or 12 years. There may be some other general conditions, but they're usually fairly light. Next, please. SEAC opinions. SEAC evaluates and formulates its recommendations on the basis of several criteria. Whether the applicant's assessment of risk-benefit is plausible, when the risks are not adequately controlled. The SEAC only comes into play in the non-threshold situation. They look particularly whether the technical and the economic feasibility and availability of alternatives is there. And it's technical and economic feasibility. Alternatives may be technically there, but they may be totally economically unfeasible, vice versa. So there's a lot of thought goes into that. That's really the key of SEAC's considerations. They look at the comments from the public consultation particularly because the main purpose is to gather information on alternatives. And they look at the evidence presented in the time limit of review period requested by the applicant. A long review period, max 12 years, has to be properly justified. It doesn't happen because you ask for it. Next, please. A little bit of track record. These are the 30-odd substances which we have dealt with in 4 years. You'll see in the middle there that the 16 chromium-6 substances have by far and away dominated this, but some of the solvents like EDC, trichloroethylene have also been fairly sizable parts of work. 115 applications from 199 applicants and just shy of 190 separate opinions from RAC. Point to make here is that most substances we've dealt with, next slide please, sorry. Most substances we have dealt with have been non-threshold. They're mainly genotoxic carcinogens, or there's one PBT in there. You can see it third from the top, hexabromocyclododecane. There's only 2 thresholds, that's the phthalates and diglyme. And if we were to do the phthalates again, of course, they probably would not be threshold at this stage, so that's changed as well in the interim. But I think that's a point to remember. Most of our experience is in dealing with non-threshold substances. So that's a pretty good starting point for this particular exercise, even though it is environment. Next, please. I'm drawing to a conclusion now very shortly. This is another important slide for people preparing an application and considering how to configure it. If you want further information on this, there's a whole document to support it which contains information on downstream and what we call upstream applications. Let me just run through it quickly. At the simplest scale, a single applicant applies for their own use on their own sites. So one company with a couple of sites maybe. We've seen a maximum of about 5 or 6 sites. Typical compact downstream application We've seen SMEs submit these successfully. We've also seen large-scale multinationals submit them, obviously, and everything in between. They should be clear and easy to evaluate. There is no reason why the companies involved here can't do this. Amazingly small companies have shown that they can do this very successfully. Some even without the help of consultants, I hasten to add. But if we were to get, being quite honest, everything in as single applications, we would be swamped. So we're looking much more interestedly at the second line here. This is where a consortium comes together, single or multiple own uses on multiple named sites. And the named sites is the key thing here. We've seen these done for chromates where 11, 12 applicants have clubbed together, covering anything up to about 25 different sites. They've put their data together. They've attempted to tell us that this is representative of our operational conditions and our risk management measures, and they provided at least some exposure data to try and prove the case. With sufficient detail, this is a very efficient way to go. And it's something which I think will be the workhorse of authorization in the future. The bottom line is a tricky one. We've seen single applicants on behalf of their entire supply chain, or big consortia with single or multiple uses on multiple, mostly unnamed sites, so covering part of an entire supply chain. Largest tonnages close to 10,000 tons, and number of potentially exposed workers in this case into 5 figures, easy, possibly more. So very large upstream applications where representative standards, sort of minimum standards of operational conditions, risk management measures, and exposure data have proposed. But there's quite a few problems. The scale of the exposure scenario can really lack credibility. It's just so big that it's very hard to find a focus in it. Representativeness of the data and the connection between the risk management measures and the exposure data gets lost. So representative just basically disappears. And I think there's very often an underestimation of how difficult supply chain investigations are. I'm now 2 minutes over time. I can see my colleagues getting nervous on each side, so I'll proceed on. Next one, please, Ivan. Thank you. This slide you can read later, but basically this is the earlier nonophenol and ethoxylate restriction, entry 46. So not 46A, the more recent one for textiles. And these are the conditions, and these are the exemptions. So industrial and institutional cleaning, closely controlled dry cleaning systems where the washing liquid is recycled or incinerated, and it goes on and on and on down the page. So extremely tightly controlled, if not closed conditions, are already there in an old restriction which predates REACH. So people were thinking ahead even way back then. You need to have a look at this because it gives you some idea of where this could head. And then the next one and last slide, please. This is just a quote from Article 60.10 of REACH, granting an authorization. So notwithstanding any condition of an authorization, the holder shall ensure that the exposure is reduced to as low a level as is technically and practically possible. And this applies regardless of whether the adequate control or socioeconomic routes are followed. It doesn't matter. Minimization is for us the key in this. I think that's my last slide. Thanks, Ivan. So thank you. You've heard some of the points which other speakers are going to pick up on. We'll move on with the next speaker straight away, if you don't mind, and we'll pick up on the discussion at whatever point we can.